The kitchen light still burns in the Seavers home on Jarvis Road. It has burned for 10 years now, casting the same amber glow across granite countertops where Teresa once prepared breakfast for her daughters. The house remembers what happened that night in June 2015. The walls remember the sound of a hammer. The neighbors remember the sirens. But Bonita Springs, Florida, tried to forget. For nearly a decade, the case lived in whispered conversations at the grocery store, in the uncomfortable silences of former patients, in the hollowed eyes of Teresa's daughters who grew up without answers. The Restorative Health and Healing Center closed its doors. The Memorial Garden grew wild. Life moved on because life had to, until October 2025, when Curtis Wainwright Jr. finally broke his silence from behind prison walls. His words would resurrect a nightmare the community thought was buried, revealing that some betrayals cut so deep they echo across generations. What really happened the night Teresa Seavers came home? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Teresa Seavers believed in second chances. Her patients knew this the moment they walked through the glass doors of Restorative Health and Healing Center, where traditional medicine met holistic healing in ways that gave hope to the hopeless. The waiting room buzzed with the quiet conversations of people who had found their last resort in Dr. Seavers' compassionate care. On this particular Sunday morning in June 2015, the center sat empty, its silence broken only by the hum of air conditioning against the Florida heat. Teresa was supposed to be in Connecticut with her family, enjoying a rare weekend away from the demands of her practice. But plans had changed, as they often did in her world of urgent calls and patient needs. Mark Seavers scrolled through his phone in the hotel room, his wife's absence creating a hollow space beside him. On the bed, their daughters splashed in the hotel pool below, their laughter drifting through the window like a memory of simpler times. The family trip had been Teresa's idea, a chance to reconnect, to step away from the pressures that had been building like storm clouds over their marriage. But Teresa's flight home had already been booked. The decision seemed routine at the time. Teresa would fly back early to handle an emergency at the clinic, while Mark and the girls would drive home the next day. It was the kind of sacrifice that defined their marriage. Teresa's work always demanding a little more, Mark always accommodating a little less gracefully. At Southwest Florida International Airport, Teresa's heels clicked against the polished floor as she made her way through the terminal. Fellow passengers noticed her, the kind of woman who carried herself with purpose, her medical bag slung over one shoulder, her phone pressed to her ear as she coordinated patient care from 30,000 feet above the problems waiting below. The Uber driver who picked her up at the airport would later remember her kindness, the way she asked about his family, her genuine interest in his story. She tipped well, as she always did, understanding that everyone was fighting battles she couldn't see. As the car pulled into the circular driveway on Jarvis Road, Teresa felt the familiar weight of home settling around her. The house stood quiet in the evening light, its windows dark, except for the security system's blinking red eye. Mark had insisted on the upgraded system after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood, though Teresa had wondered aloud whether their peaceful street really needed such precautions. She paid the driver and gathered her bags, keys already in hand as she approached the front door. The house welcomed her with its familiar smell of vanilla candles and the faint antiseptic scent that seemed to follow her home from the clinic. She set her bags down in the foyer and checked her phone. 3 missed calls from patients, 2 from Mark, and a text from her best friend, asking if she'd made it home safely. The kitchen light switched on automatically as she entered, motion sensors illuminating the space where she had shared countless meals with her daughters, where homework battles and bedtime negotiations had shaped the rhythm of their family life. The counter held a stack of mail Mark had left for her, bills and patient correspondence that would wait until morning. Teresa poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window overlooking the backyard, where her daughter's swing set cast long shadows in the fading light. In a few hours, Mark would put the girls to bed in their Connecticut hotel room, probably letting them stay up later than usual, probably ordering room service as a special treat. She smiled at the thought, then turned back toward the hallway that led to her bedroom, ready to change out of her travel clothes and settle in for a quiet evening at home. The hammer came from behind. Dawn broke over Bonita Springs with a kind of relentless brightness that makes tragedy feel impossible. Birds sang in the oak trees lining Jarvis Road. Sprinkler systems activated across manicured lawns. The world continued its rotation, as if nothing had changed in the universe, as if Teresa Seavers' heart wasn't already growing cold on her kitchen floor. Mark's phone rang at 6:47 a.m. The caller ID showed Sandra Hoskins, Teresa's closest friend and the office manager at Restorative Health. Her voice carried that particular edge that comes with intuition proven right. "Mark, I'm worried. Teresa was supposed to call me when she got home, and she's not answering her phone. I've been trying her all morning." Through the hotel room window, Mark could see his daughters already awake, excited about the continental breakfast and the long drive home. He rubbed his eyes, struggling to focus on Sandra's words. "Maybe she's just tired. The flight got in pretty late." "No, Mark, this isn't like her. You know Teresa, she always calls. Always." "I'm going over to the house." The conversation ended with the kind of silence that precedes storms. Mark stared at his phone, thumb hovering over Teresa's number, some instinct keeping him from making the call. Instead, he asked Sandra to check on his wife, a request that would later be dissected by investigators, lawyers, and a jury of his peers. Sandra Hoskins had known Teresa Sievers for over a decade. She had watched her friend build a medical practice from nothing, had celebrated the birth of both daughters, had shared the quiet confidences that bind women together through the complications of marriage and motherhood. If anyone could read the signs of Teresa's moods, it was Sandra. The Sievers house looked peaceful from the street. Sandra pulled into the driveway, noting Teresa's absence. Her car wasn't there, which seemed strange since she should have been home for hours. The front door stood locked, security system armed, everything appearing normal except for the crushing silence that seemed to emanate from within. Sandra used her spare key, a privilege Teresa had extended after years of friendship and professional partnership. She called out as she entered, her voice echoing through the foyer in a way that made the emptiness feel deliberate, almost aggressive. "Teresa, are you here?" The house answered with silence. Sandra's footsteps sounded unnaturally loud as she moved from room to room, her anxiety building with each empty space. The master bedroom showed no signs of recent occupancy. The bathroom was pristine. Teresa's travel clothes weren't scattered across the chair where she always left them after long trips. It was in the kitchen that Sandra's world tilted off its axis. Teresa lay on the travertine floor, her body positioned in a way that spoke of violence, of sudden terror, of a life interrupted mid-breath. Blood had pooled beneath her head, dark and thick, painting abstract patterns on the stone that had once reflected the laughter of her children. Sandra's screams shattered the morning quiet, a sound that would echo in her memory for the rest of her life. Neighbors later said they heard it through closed windows and air conditioning units, a cry so primal it made them look up from their coffee and wonder what catastrophe had found their peaceful street. The 911 call came at 9:43 a.m. 911, what's your emergency? Oh God, she's dead. Teresa's dead. There's blood everywhere. Ma'am, I need you to calm down and tell me what's happening. It's my friend, Dr. Teresa Sievers. She's been murdered. Someone murdered her in her own kitchen. The first responders arrived at 9:47 a.m., their sirens announcing to Jarvis Road that Paradise had been breached. Paramedics who had worked with Teresa at the hospital found themselves standing over her body, their training at war with their grief. The kitchen, where she had once treated their own family members, became a crime scene, marked off with yellow tape that fluttered in the morning breeze like tiny flags of surrender. Detective Jimmy Ray Carlin had seen enough murder scenes to know immediately that this wasn't random violence. The lack of forced entry, the position of the body, the deliberate brutality of the attack, everything pointed to a killer who knew Teresa Sievers, who had planned this moment, who had walked through her front door with murder already decided. The weapon lay beside her, a hammer, unremarkable except for its purpose, purchased somewhere and wielded by someone who had reduced a brilliant physician to a collection of evidence bags and crime scene photographs. While investigators began their methodical documentation of death, Mark Sievers was fielding phone calls at the Connecticut hotel. Sandra's voice, broken by shock, delivered the news that would reshape his life forever. "Mark, you need to come home. Teresa's gone." His response, later scrutinized by investigators, was notable for its control. No screaming, no demands for explanation, no immediate collapse into grief. Instead, practical questions: how, when, who found her? The kind of questions that suggested either remarkable composure or careful preparation. Mark gathered his daughters 8-year-old Josephine and 11-year-old Carmi and began the long drive south, their excited chatter gradually giving way to confused silence as phone calls interrupted the journey and their father's demeanor grew increasingly tense. Back in Bonita Springs, the news spread through the medical community like contagion. Teresa's patients began calling the clinic, seeking appointments with a doctor who would never see them again. Her colleagues at the hospital struggled to process the loss of a woman who had been vibrantly alive just hours before. The crime scene investigation revealed unsettling details. The security system had been disarmed from inside the house, suggesting Teresa had let her killer in. There were no signs of robbery. Her purse, jewelry, and other valuables remained untouched. The attack had been focused, brutal, and personal. Detective Carlin interviewed the neighbors, collecting the mundane details that form the background of extraordinary crimes. No one had heard screams. No one had seen suspicious vehicles. The street cameras that might have captured the killer's approach had been mysteriously disabled weeks earlier. As evening fell on that first day, the investigation was already expanding beyond the crime scene itself. Financial records were subpoenaed. Phone logs were analyzed. The comfortable assumption that Teresa's killer was a stranger began to crumble under the weight of evidence, pointing towards someone much closer to home. Mark arrived home to find his life transformed into a crime scene. Police cars lined his street. Investigators swarmed his house. Neighbors stood in clusters, their shocked faces reflecting a community's sudden realization that violence could find them anywhere, that safety was always an illusion. His daughters waited in a friend's house, protected from the sight of their home wrapped in yellow tape, shielded from the knowledge of what had happened in the kitchen where their mother used to make their breakfast. Mark's first priority, he told investigators, was finding them a place to stay while the house was processed for evidence. His second priority, though he didn't say this aloud, was finding a lawyer. The investigation into Teresa Seaver's murder began with the assumption that truth would emerge quickly. Bonita Springs was not a city accustomed to unsolved homicides, and the brutal nature of the crime demanded swift justice. Detective Jimmy Ray Carlin assembled a task force that included seasoned investigators, forensic specialists, and federal agents whose expertise in complex cases would prove essential. The first weeks yielded frustrating dead ends. Teresa's patient files revealed no obvious threats, no disgruntled individuals who might have escalated their grievances to murder. Her financial records showed a successful practice generating steady income. Her personal life appeared stable, built around her medical career and her devotion to her daughters. Mark Sievers presented himself as a grieving widower, cooperative with investigators while simultaneously shielding his children from the most traumatic aspects of their new reality. He moved them out of the house on Jarvis Road, relocating to a rental property where they could begin the impossible process of life without Teresa. The funeral drew hundreds of mourners, colleagues from the medical community, patients whose lives Teresa had touched, friends who struggled to reconcile the vibrant woman they remembered with the victim of such senseless violence. Mark delivered a eulogy that struck observers as remarkably composed, though grief, they reasoned, affects everyone differently. 3 weeks into the investigation, a breakthrough emerged from an unexpected source. Teresa's life insurance policies, initially viewed as routine financial planning, revealed a troubling pattern. Multiple policies totaling nearly $5 million had been purchased in the months leading up to her death. With Mark as the primary beneficiary, Detective Carlin had investigated enough domestic homicides to recognize the significance of sudden changes in life insurance coverage. When he dug deeper into the Sievers family finances, a picture began to emerge that contradicted the image of marital stability Mark had presented. The medical practice was struggling. Patient volume had declined as competition from larger healthcare systems intensified. Mark, who managed the business side of Teresa's practice, had been juggling bills and delaying payments to vendors. Credit card debt had mounted steadily, and the couple's lavish lifestyle was increasingly unsustainable. More troubling were the marital problems that friends and family had observed but been reluctant to discuss. Teresa had confided in Sandra Hoskins about growing tensions with Mark, his resentment of her career success, his increasing demands for attention that she couldn't provide while maintaining her practice. A few months before her death, Teresa had consulted a divorce attorney. The consultation, conducted in confidence, revealed her concerns about Mark's financial management and her growing certainty that their marriage was irreparable. She worried about custody of their daughters, knowing that Mark would fight for control and that a divorce would expose the family's financial vulnerabilities. The attorney's notes, subpoenaed during the investigation, painted a picture of a woman trapped between her professional obligations and her personal unhappiness. Teresa wanted out of her marriage, but she feared the consequences for her children, for her practice, and for her financial security. These revelations shifted the investigation's focus. Mark Sievers, initially viewed as a grieving victim, became a person of interest. His alibi being in Connecticut with his daughters at the time of the murder seemed airtight, but investigators knew that alibis could be constructed, that murder could be outsourced. The hammer used to kill Teresa yielded no fingerprints except hers, but forensic analysis suggested it had been purchased recently. Store security footage from home improvement retailers in the area was reviewed, but the quality was poor and the volume enormous. As summer turned to fall, the investigation stalled. The task force had identified a likely motive and a primary suspect, but they lacked the evidence necessary for an arrest. Mark continued his life as a single father, selling the house on Jarvis Road and moving with his daughters to a new community where they could escape the constant reminders of their tragedy. The case that would ultimately unravel Mark Seaver's carefully constructed facade began with a routine review of cellular data. In November 2015, nearly 6 months after Teresa's murder, federal investigators obtained comprehensive cell phone records for all devices connected to the Seavers family accounts. The analysis revealed an anomaly that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. On the weekend of Teresa's murder, 2 phone numbers had traveled an unusual route from Missouri to Southwest Florida and back again, a round trip of over 2,000 miles completed in less than 72 hours. Detective Carlin traced the numbers to Curtis Wayne Wright Jr. and Jimmy Ray Rogers, both residents of Hillsborough, Missouri. Wright's name triggered recognition in Mark's phone records, frequent calls between the two men in the months leading up to Teresa's death, conversations that lasted for hours and occurred at odd times of day and night. Wright had been Mark's childhood friend, a relationship that had persevered despite the geographic distance and divergent paths their lives had taken. While Mark built a life in Florida's medical community, Wright had struggled with the law, accumulating a record of minor crimes and bad decisions that had limited his opportunities. The Missouri State Police provided background on both men. Wright was unemployed, recently divorced, and facing financial pressures that made him susceptible to offers of quick money. Rogers, his frequent companion, had a more extensive criminal history, including burglary and assault charges. Together, they represented exactly the kind of desperate alliance that could be recruited for murder. GPS data from the vehicles Wright and Rogers had used told an even more compelling story. The electronic breadcrumbs showed their cars traveling south on Interstate 55, then east on Interstate 10, making stops at gas stations and restaurants that security cameras had captured on the weekend. Teresa died. The breakthrough that transformed suspicion into actionable evidence came from an unexpected source, a Walmart in Estero, Florida, less than 10 miles from the Seavers home. Security footage from the store showed Wright and Rogers purchasing hammers, garbage bags, black towels, and flushable wet wipes on Saturday evening, June 27, 2015, less than 24 hours before Teresa's murder. The timestamp on the receipt placed them in the area with murder weapons and cleanup supplies, their presence in Southwest Florida no longer coincidental but purposeful and damning. Detective Carlin knew he had found Teresa's killers, but the evidence raised more questions than it answered. Why had Wright and Rogers driven across multiple states to commit murder in a place they had no connection to? Who had provided them with information about Teresa's travel schedule, her security system, her habits? The investigation refocused on Mark Seavers with new intensity. Phone records showed multiple calls between Mark and Wright in the days before Teresa's return from Connecticut. The timing suggested coordination, planning, a conspiracy that had been months in the making. Financial records revealed that Mark had been in contact with Wright about potential business opportunities, conversations that investigators now viewed as euphemisms for a more sinister arrangement. The life insurance policies that would pay out millions upon Teresa's death provided the motive. Wright and Rogers provided the means. As winter deepened, federal prosecutors began building a case for murder for hire, the most serious criminal charge in their jurisdiction. The evidence was largely circumstantial but comprehensive phone records, GPS data, financial documents, and security footage that collectively painted a picture of calculated murder. The arrest of Curtis Wayne Wright Jr. came on a cold February morning in 2016, 8 months after Teresa Seavers' murder. Missouri State Police surrounded Wright's trailer home with the kind of overwhelming force reserved for suspects in capital cases. He surrendered without resistance, his expression suggesting he had been expecting this moment since the weekend he drove back from Florida with blood on his conscience. Jimmy Ray Rogers was taken into custody simultaneously at his girlfriend's apartment. Unlike Wright, Rogers seemed genuinely surprised by his arrest, his confusion either authentic or expertly performed. The two men were separated immediately, each facing federal charges that carried the potential for life in prison or death. In Florida, Mark Seavers continued his routine as a devoted father, driving his daughters to school, helping with homework, maintaining the facade of a man rebuilding his life after unthinkable loss. He had remarried, finding solace in the arms of a woman who believed in his innocence and offered stability for his daughters. But investigators were watching, gathering evidence, building the case that would eventually bring him down. Wright's attorney, faced with overwhelming evidence against his client, began plea negotiations almost immediately. The GPS data, the Walmart footage, The cell phone records, the digital trail Wright and Rogers had left, was impossible to explain away as coincidence. More damaging was Wright's connection to Mark Sievers, a relationship that investigators had mapped through years of phone records and financial transactions. Bank deposits to Wright's account corresponded with phone calls from Mark. Dates and times aligned with precision that suggested careful planning rather than casual friendship. The plea negotiations revealed the depths of Wright's desperation and the callousness of the conspiracy he had entered. Wright told investigators that Mark had approached him months before Teresa's death, describing his wife as a burden, an obstacle to his happiness and financial security. According to Wright's eventual testimony, Mark had painted Teresa as a controlling woman who threatened to destroy him in a divorce, to take his children and leave him with nothing. The life insurance money would provide a fresh start, Mark claimed, an opportunity to build a new life free from the pressures that were crushing him. Wright admitted to investigators that he had initially dismissed Mark's talk as fantasy, the kind of bitter venting that unhappy spouses sometimes indulge in without serious intent. But as Mark's calls became more frequent and more specific, Wright began to understand that his childhood friend was serious about having his wife murdered. The financial arrangement was straightforward. Wright would receive $100,000 for organizing Teresa's death, a sum that represented more money than he had ever possessed. Rogers would receive a smaller payment for his participation, though Wright suggested that Rogers hadn't fully understood the nature of their Florida trip until they were already committed to the plan. Wright's confession to investigators included details that had never been made public, information that only Teresa's killer could have known. The layout of the house, the location of the security system panel, Teresa's habits and schedule details that Mark had provided during their planning conversations. Most damaging was Wright's account of the murder itself. He described waiting in the house for Teresa to return from the airport, hiding in the garage until she disarmed the security system and settled into her evening routine. The attack had been swift and brutal, intended to ensure that Teresa could never identify her assailants or survive to testify against them. The indictment of Mark Sievers came in January 2017, nearly 2 years after his wife's murder. The grand jury proceedings had been conducted in secret, but the charges were public and devastating: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation to commit murder. Mark's arrest at his home was witnessed by his daughters, who watched from a neighbor's window as their father was handcuffed and placed in a police car. The trauma of losing their mother was compounded by the realization that their father was accused of orchestrating her death, a betrayal so profound that it shattered their understanding of family, love, and safety. The trial began in December 2019, nearly 4.5 years after Teresa's murder. The delay had been caused by the complexity of the case, the volume of evidence, and the legal maneuvering that accompanies capital cases. Mark had been held without bail, his life reduced to a jail cell, and legal conferences with attorneys who struggled to construct a defense against overwhelming evidence. And Mark had been held without bail. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. Phone records showed hundreds of calls between Mark and Wright in the months before the murder. GPS data placed Wright and Rogers in Florida at the time Teresa was killed. Surveillance footage showed them purchasing the weapons and supplies used in the crime. Wright's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. He described the conspiracy in detail, explaining how Mark had recruited him through a combination of financial desperation and appeals to their childhood friendship. Wright admitted his guilt, acknowledged the horror of what he had done, and accepted his role in destroying Teresa's family. Under cross-examination, Wright faced withering attacks on his credibility. Defense attorneys portrayed him as a career criminal who would say anything to reduce his sentence, a desperate man whose testimony was bought and paid for by prosecutors seeking a conviction. But Wright's story never wavered. He answered every question, acknowledged every inconsistency, and maintained that Mark Sievers had hired him to kill Teresa. His detailed knowledge of the crime scene and the planning conversations supported his testimony in ways that made it difficult to dismiss as fabrication. The defense's strategy focused on reasonable doubt. Mark's attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that a conspiracy requiring such extensive coordination was unlikely, that Mark's grief over his wife's death was genuine and inconsistent with guilt. They challenged the reliability of digital evidence, suggesting that phone records could be misinterpreted and that GPS data was not always accurate. They questioned Wright's motives for cooperation, arguing that his testimony was self-serving and unreliable. Most importantly, they attacked the motive prosecutors had attributed to Mark, The life insurance policies would never have paid out if Mark had been convicted of Teresa's murder, they argued. The financial problems facing the medical practice were temporary and manageable. The marital difficulties were not severe enough to justify murder. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. Mark Sievers showed no emotion as the verdict was read, his composure finally cracking only when he realized that he would never again be free to see his daughters grow up. The penalty phase of Mark Sievers' trial began 3 weeks after his conviction, a separate proceeding that would determine whether he lived or died for his crimes. Under Florida law, the jury's recommendation would guide but not bind the judge's final decision on sentencing. Teresa's family members took the witness stand to describe the impact of her death. Her mother spoke of losing a daughter who had been the pride of their family, a successful physician who had dedicated her life to healing others. Teresa's sister described the grief that had consumed their family, the holidays that would never feel complete, the grandchildren who would grow up without knowing their aunt. Most devastating was the testimony about Teresa's daughters. Now teenagers, they had lived for years with the knowledge that their father had orchestrated their mother's murder. The psychological trauma had required extensive therapy, and their future remained uncertain as they grappled with loss that no children should ever have to endure. The prosecution presented evidence of Mark's lack of remorse, his attempts to manipulate the legal system, his continued insistence on his innocence, despite overwhelming evidence of guilt. They argued that the premeditated nature of the crime, the involvement of hired killers, and the destruction of Teresa's family warranted the ultimate penalty. The defense pleaded for Mark's life, focusing on his role as a father and his lack of a criminal history. They argued that life in prison would serve the interests of justice without requiring the state to take another life. They emphasized the impact his execution would have on his daughters, who had already lost their mother and would lose their father as well. Character witnesses testified to Mark's devotion to his children, his involvement in their education and extracurricular activities, his efforts to provide stability after Teresa's death. Former patients of Teresa's practice described Mark's kindness and professionalism in managing their care, but these testimonials were overshadowed by the nature of the crime itself. The jury had heard Wright's description of the murder, the brutality of the attack, the planning that had gone into ensuring Teresa's death. The image of her lying on her kitchen floor, killed by weapons purchased by men her husband had hired, was impossible to reconcile with character witnesses' descriptions of Mark as a caring father. The jury's recommendation was unanimous: death. They found that the aggravating factors, the heinous nature of the crime, the financial motive, the use of hired killers, outweighed any mitigating circumstances Mark's attorneys had presented. Judge Bruce Kyle scheduled the formal sentencing for 6 weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare final argument. The courtroom was packed with Teresa's supporters, colleagues from the medical community, and members of the media who had followed the case from its beginning. Mark's daughters were not present for the sentencing. They had chosen to remember their father as he had been before their world collapsed, rather than witness the moment when the state formally condemned him to death. Judge Kyle's sentence matched the jury's recommendation. Mark Sievers would be executed for the murder of his wife, joining the hundreds of other condemned prisoners on Florida's death row. The Florida Supreme Court's review of Mark Sievers' conviction and death sentence would take 3 years, a period during which he remained in solitary confinement at Union Correctional Institution. Death row inmates in Florida are housed in 6 by 9 foot cells for 22 hours each day, their contact with the outside world limited to legal visits, correspondence, and brief periods in a concrete exercise yard. Mark's attorneys filed a comprehensive appeal challenging every aspect of his trial. They argued that the evidence was insufficient to support a conviction, that Wright's testimony was unreliable, that the jury had been improperly influenced by inflammatory evidence. They claimed procedural errors had occurred during jury selection and that the judge had made mistakes in admitting certain evidence. The state attorney's office, now under new leadership, defended the conviction with equal vigor. They argued that the evidence against Mark was overwhelming, that his trial had been conducted fairly, and that his sentence was appropriate for the heinous nature of his crimes. In July 2022, the Florida Supreme Court upheld Mark's conviction and death sentence. The court's opinion, spanning over 100 pages, addressed each of the defense's arguments and found them without merit. The evidence against Mark was substantial and credible, the court ruled, and his trial had been conducted in accordance with legal standards. The court's decision triggered the next phase of Mark's appeals process. His attorneys filed a petition for post-conviction relief, arguing that he had received ineffective assistance of counsel during his original trial. These claims would require extensive investigation and could take years to resolve. Meanwhile, Curtis Wayne Wright Jr. served his 25-year sentence at a federal facility in another state. He had testified truthfully at Mark's trial, fulfilling his end of the plea agreement that had spared him from execution. Occasionally, he granted interviews to journalists, maintaining his account of the conspiracy and expressing remorse for his role in Teresa's death. Jimmy Ray Rogers had been tried separately and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He maintained his innocence throughout his trial, claiming that he had accompanied Wright to Florida without knowing their true purpose. The jury had rejected his claims, finding the evidence of his participation convincing. Teresa's daughters, now young adults, had largely avoided public attention. They had been raised by Teresa's family members, who had provided stability and love while helping them process the unimaginable trauma of their childhood. Occasionally, they issued statements through family attorneys, thanking the community for its support and asking for privacy as they built their adult lives. The Restorative Health and Healing Center had never reopened. The building stood empty for several years before being purchased and converted to other medical offices. Teresa's former patients had scattered to other physicians, carrying with them memories of a doctor who had cared for them with exceptional compassion. In Bonita Springs, Teresa's murder had become part of the community's shared history, a reminder that evil could exist behind the facade of suburban respectability. The case had shattered assumptions about safety and trust, teaching residents that violence could emerge from the most unexpected sources. October 2025 brought an unexpected development in the Mark Sievers case. Curtis Wayne Wright Jr., now serving the 9th year of his sentence, contacted federal prosecutors with new information he claimed to have withheld during his original testimony. Wright's attorney arranged for a proffer session, a formal meeting where Wright could share his information without immediately incriminating himself in additional crimes. The revelation was startling. Wright claimed that Mark's conspiracy to murder Teresa had been even more extensive than prosecutors had originally understood. According to Wright, Mark had approached him not once but multiple times over a period of years, initially asking Wright to help him stage Teresa's death as an accident. Wright described conversations in which Mark had fantasized about various scenarios: a car accident, a home invasion gone wrong, a medical emergency that could be induced without detection. Mark had rejected these options as too risky or too likely to be detected by investigators, eventually settling on the brutal hammer attack that would appear to be the work of strangers. More disturbing were Wright's claims about Mark's behavior after Teresa's death. According to Wright, Mark had called him multiple times in the weeks following the murder, not to express grief or remorse, but to discuss how they could better cover their tracks. Mark had been concerned about digital evidence and had asked Wright to dispose of cell phones and other potential evidence. Wright also claimed that Mark had planned to collect the life insurance money and relocate with his daughters to another state, where he could start fresh without the scrutiny that would inevitably follow him in Florida. The plan had been derailed by the investigation's progress and Mark's eventual arrest. Federal prosecutors were skeptical of Wright's new claims. His original testimony had been thoroughly tested during Mark's trial, and his credibility had been a constant issue throughout the proceedings. The timing of his new revelations, coming nearly a decade after the original crime, raised questions about his motives. Wright's attorney argued that his client had been traumatized by his participation in the murder and had needed years of reflection to fully process what had happened. The additional information, if true, demonstrated the depth of Mark's premeditation and the cold-blooded nature of his planning. Legal experts following the case were divided on the significance of Wright's new claims. Some argued that the additional information was largely irrelevant, since Mark had already been convicted and sentenced to death based on the evidence presented at his original trial. Others suggested that the revelations could impact ongoing appeals or potential clemency proceedings. Mark's appellate attorneys dismissed Wright's new claims as the desperate lies of a man seeking attention or hoping to improve his own legal situation. They argued that Wright had fabricated the additional details to insert himself back into a case that had moved beyond him. The federal prosecutors ultimately decided not to pursue additional charges based on Wright's new information. The existing conviction and death sentence already reflected the full scope of Mark's culpability, and further prosecution would serve no meaningful purpose. The passage of a decade had transformed the lives of everyone touched by Teresa Sievers' murder. Her daughters, Josephine and Carmi, had grown into young women whose resilience honored their mother's memory while carrying forward the strength she had embodied. They rarely spoke publicly about their experiences, choosing instead to focus on their education and their futures. Teresa's medical colleagues had established a scholarship in her name, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in holistic medicine. The scholarship recipients were selected not only for their academic achievement but for their demonstration of the compassion and dedication that had defined Teresa's approach to patient care. The Bonita Springs medical community had never fully recovered from the loss of one of its most respected practitioners. Teresa's approach to integrative medicine had been ahead of its time, and her death had robbed the community of a physician who might have continued advancing the field for decades to come. Mark Sievers remained on death row, his appeals continuing through the federal court system. His attorneys had filed a habeas corpus petition challenging his conviction on constitutional grounds, arguing that his trial had been fundamentally unfair due to pretrial publicity and procedural errors. The legal proceedings moved with the glacial pace typical of capital cases. Each appeal required extensive briefing, oral arguments, and judicial deliberation. The process could continue for years or even decades, during which Mark would remain in solitary confinement, aging, while his daughters grew up without him. Prison records showed that Mark had been a model inmate, avoiding disciplinary actions and participating in available educational programs. He had earned his GED and taken correspondence courses in various subjects, maintaining the intellectual curiosity that had once helped him manage Teresa's medical practice. His daughters had not visited him in prison. Through their attorneys, they had indicated their desire to move forward with their lives without the burden of maintaining a relationship with the man who had orchestrated their mother's death. The decision, while painful, reflected their commitment to healing and their recognition that some wounds could only close through separation. Curtis Wainwright Jr. had adapted to prison life with the resignation of a man who understood that his choices had led him to this inevitable destination. He worked in the prison library, helping other inmates with legal research and literacy programs. His cooperation with prosecutors had earned him some measure of respect among both inmates and staff, though it had also marked him as a snitch in a world where such labels carried dangerous implications. Wright had written letters to Teresa's family, expressing remorse for his role in her death and asking for forgiveness he knew he might never receive. The letters had been forwarded through attorneys but had gone unanswered, the silence reflecting the family's decision to focus on healing rather than engaging with the man who had helped destroy their lives. Jimmy Ray Rogers had taken a different path in prison. He maintained his innocence, continuing to claim that he had been manipulated by Wright and had never understood the true purpose of their trip to Florida. His appeals had been unsuccessful, but he persisted in seeking legal remedies that might reduce his sentence or overturn his conviction. The three men, Mark, Wright, and Rogers, were housed in different facilities, their conspiracy having dissolved into individual struggles with guilt, denial, and the crushing weight of time. None would ever again be free to make the choices that had led them to become killers, their lives now measured in decades of confinement rather than years of possibility. The hammer that had killed Teresa Sievers remained in an evidence locker, a piece of metal that had been transformed into an instrument of ultimate betrayal. The weapon would likely never be destroyed, preserved indefinitely as potential evidence in appeals that could continue long after all the principals in the case had died. The house on Jarvis Road had been sold and resold, its history disclosed to buyers who had to decide whether they could live with the knowledge of what had happened in the kitchen. Most potential purchasers had walked away after learning the details, but eventually a family had bought the property at a significant discount, choosing to focus on the future rather than the past. The new owners had renovated extensively, replacing the kitchen flooring and reconfiguring the layout to erase the physical reminders of Teresa's death. But neighbors still whispered about what had happened there, and real estate agents still had to explain the property's history to prospective buyers. Teresa's legacy lived on in ways that transcended the circumstances of her death. Former patients continued to share stories of her compassionate care, describing how she had listened to their concerns when other doctors had dismissed them, how she had taken time to explain treatment options in language they could understand, how she had made them feel valued as human beings rather than just medical cases. The holistic medicine practices Teresa had championed had become more mainstream in the years since her death, vindication of her belief that healing required attention to the whole person rather than just the symptoms of disease. Medical schools now offered courses in integrative medicine that reflected the approaches Teresa had pioneered. Her daughters had chosen career paths that honored their mother's memory in different ways. Josephine had expressed interest in social work, drawn to helping children who had experienced trauma similar to her own. Carmi had shown aptitude for the sciences, though she remained undecided about whether to follow her mother into medicine. Both young women had undergone extensive therapy to process the unique trauma of their childhood. They had been forced to grapple not only with the loss of their mother, but with the knowledge that their father had been responsible for her death, a betrayal that challenged their fundamental understanding of family and safety. The therapeutic process had helped them separate their father's crimes from their memories of him as a caring parent during their early childhood. They had learned to hold both truths simultaneously, that Mark Sievers had been capable of love and devotion as a father while also being capable of orchestrating their mother's murder. Their relationship with their extended family had provided stability and continuity during the most difficult years of their lives. Teresa's parents and siblings had rallied around the girls, providing the love and guidance they needed while respecting their need to process their experiences at their own pace. The girls had also found support within the community of survivors of violent crime, connecting with other children who had lost parents to murder. These relationships had helped them understand that healing was possible, that trauma could be survived, and that their future was not defined by their past. As they approached adulthood, both daughters had expressed a desire to use their experiences to help others. They had participated in victim rights advocacy, speaking to legislators about the need for better support services for children affected by violent crime. Their strength and resilience served as a testament to Teresa's influence as a mother and to the power of community support in helping trauma survivors rebuild their lives. They had transformed their unimaginable loss into a source of compassion for others facing similar challenges. The annual memorial service held in Teresa's honor had become a gathering point for the medical community, her former patients, and others whose lives she had touched. The service emphasized celebration rather than mourning, focusing on Teresa's contributions to healing rather than the violence that had ended her life. The appeals process that would determine Mark Sievers' ultimate fate continued to wind through the federal court system with the methodical pace that characterizes capital punishment cases. His attorneys had exhausted their state-level appeals and had moved into federal court, where they would argue that his constitutional rights had been violated during his trial and sentencing. The habeas corpus petition filed on Mark's behalf challenged multiple aspects of his prosecution. His attorneys argued that pretrial publicity had made it impossible to select an impartial jury, that the prosecution had withheld exculpatory evidence, and that his original defense counsel had provided ineffective assistance. The claims of ineffective assistance centered on the defense team's failure to adequately challenge Wright's credibility and their inability to present a coherent alternative theory of the crime. Mark's appellate attorneys argued that a more competent defense could have raised reasonable doubt about his involvement in the conspiracy. Federal prosecutors countered that Mark had received a fair trial and competent representation. They argued that the evidence against him had been overwhelming, that his defense attorneys had made reasonable strategic decisions given the circumstances, and that the jury had properly considered all the evidence before reaching its verdict. The federal judge assigned to review Mark's petition would have broad discretion in determining which claims warranted further investigation. Some issues might be resolved through briefing and oral arguments, while others could require evidentiary hearings that would bring witnesses back to court years after the original trial. The process could take several more years to complete, during which Mark would remain on death row, while his daughters continued building their adult lives without him. The uncertainty was difficult for everyone involved, including Teresa's family members who wanted finality and closure. Legal experts following the case noted that successful challenges to death sentences were rare but not impossible. The most promising avenue for Mark's attorneys was likely their claim that Wright's testimony had been unreliable and that the prosecution had failed to adequately corroborate his account of the conspiracy. However, the digital evidence that had supported Wright's testimony remained compelling. The phone records, GPS data, and surveillance footage created an independent timeline that aligned with Wright's description of the conspiracy, making it difficult to dismiss his testimony as fabrication. The broader question raised by Mark's case was whether the death penalty served any meaningful purpose in cases where the defendant would never again pose a threat to society. Life imprisonment without parole would ensure that Mark could never harm anyone else, while avoiding the enormous costs and lengthy delays associated with capital punishment. Teresa's family members had expressed mixed feelings about the death penalty in Mark's case. Some believed that his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment, while others felt that his execution would not bring Teresa back or provide the closure they sought. The 10th anniversary of Teresa Seever's murder passed quietly, marked by a small memorial service attended by family members, close friends, and a few former patients who had never forgotten her compassionate care. The service was held at a seaside location Teresa had loved, where the sound of waves provided a peaceful backdrop for remembering a life that had been dedicated to healing. Her daughters, now young adults, participated in the service by reading letters they had written to their mother, sharing memories of childhood moments that had taken on greater meaning in the years since her death. Their words reflected both the pain of loss and the strength they had discovered within themselves. The memorial service also served as a reminder of how much had changed in the decades since Teresa's death. Advances in forensic technology had made it easier to solve complex cases like hers, while changes in communication patterns had created new challenges for investigators tracking suspects across state lines. The medical practice Teresa had built remained closed, but the building had found new purpose as a community health center serving low-income patients. The center's staff members were aware of the building's history and had chosen to honor Teresa's memory by continuing her commitment to compassionate care for all patients, regardless of their ability to pay. Mark's appeals continued to work their way through the federal court system, but the process had become largely invisible to the general public. The case that had once dominated headlines had faded from public consciousness, remembered primarily by those whose lives had been directly affected by Teresa's death. Curtis Wayne Wright, Jr. had become eligible for certain prison programs that allowed him to work toward a college degree through correspondence courses. His academic pursuits represented an attempt to find meaning and purpose within the confines of his sentence, though he remained haunted by his role in destroying Teresa's family. Jimmy Ray Rogers had maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration, but his appeals had been unsuccessful. He faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, his claims of manipulation and coercion having failed to convince appellate courts that his conviction was unjust. The three men who had conspired to end Teresa's life now lived separate existences, defined by concrete walls and barbed wire, their conspiracy having dissolved into individual struggles with guilt, denial, and the passage of time. None would ever again experience the freedom they had sacrificed when they chose to become killers. The community of Bonita Springs had largely moved on from the shock and fear that had followed Teresa's murder. New residents had arrived who knew nothing of the case, while longtime residents had integrated the tragedy into their community's history, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of cherishing those they loved. The final chapter in the Teresa Seevers case remained unwritten as 2025 drew to a close. Mark Seevers continued to await the outcome of his federal appeals, a process that could continue for years or even decades. His daughters had built new lives that honored their mother's memory while allowing them to move forward with hope and purpose. The case had become a study in the long-term effects of violent crime on families and communities. Teresa's death had shattered assumptions about safety and trust, but it had also demonstrated the resilience of the human spirit and the power of community support in helping survivors heal. The justice system had functioned as designed, identifying and prosecuting those responsible for Teresa's murder. But the case had also highlighted the limitations of justice in restoring what had been lost. No verdict could bring Teresa back to her daughters. No sentence could undo the trauma they had experienced. No legal proceeding could fully repair the damage that had been done. The broader lessons of the case extended beyond the particulars of the crime itself. Teresa's story served as a reminder of the importance of recognizing domestic violence warning signs, of the need for better support systems for families facing financial crisis, and of the complex factors that can lead seemingly ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence. Her death had also underscored the vital role that healthcare providers play in their communities, touching lives in ways that extend far beyond medical treatment. Teresa's patients remembered her not just as a skilled physician, but as someone who had seen them as complete human beings deserving of compassion and respect. The case would likely continue to be studied by criminologists, legal scholars, and others seeking to understand the psychology of murder-for-hire cases. The digital evidence that had been crucial to solving the crime represented a new era in law enforcement, where electronic communications and location data could provide investigators with unprecedented insight into criminal conspiracies. As the sun set over Bonita Springs on another day without Teresa Seevers, her daughters prepared for futures that would be shaped by their past but not defined by it. They carried forward their mother's legacy of compassion and service, transformed by tragedy but not broken by it. The hammer that had ended Teresa's life remained locked in an evidence room, a piece of metal that had become the instrument of ultimate betrayal. But Teresa's true legacy lived on in the lives she had touched, the patients she had healed, and the daughters who would carry her memory into a future she would never see but had helped to shape through her love and example. In the end, justice had been served, but healing remained a work in progress for Teresa's family, for her community, and for a society still struggling to understand how love could be twisted into hatred, how trust could be transformed into betrayal, and how ordinary people could become capable of the most extraordinary evil.